When I left DC the first time, I said, I am never going back, ever. And of course, I was less than 2 years, I was back. But as you will know, I love that I'm in a college town, and I know I'm in a college town because they say, nobody worries about parking there. So it's clearly a college town, right? And I will go home after this, Missouri, to see my wife and dog who said they were not going to DC and are both enjoying my house in Missouri. So I'm nice to be here, my first trip to Manhattan. So I'm happy to be here with you all. All right. Now, I had a brief interaction with some of the organizers who said, do you want to take questions at the end or in the middle? And I said, I don't, for a long way. I said, I didn't care. And they didn't tell me which they preferred. Is there any preference? You guys have questions
on what you want, and so yeah, take it.
All right, you got a burning question. I love interaction. Don't hesitate. All right, and we'll go through. What you will see is a presentation that is a mix of markets and things that concern me, but not nearly everything that concerns me. So I'm basically saying you're my public therapy on things that are keeping me up at night. All right, and as Joe points out, I'm not going to show you a bunch of bar charts. But he kind of ruined my standard opening, which is I show the word charts from USDA. You all go, oh my God, it's going to show us a bunch of word charts. And I say the only reason I'm showing you this is you have a secretary, deputy secretary, agriculture, because if there's a change in administration, I don't go anywhere. I'm one of the few people. I'm the only person who's not an infrastructure person on the secretary's sub-cabinet who's not a political appointee. And as you go through this, you'll understand why that's a really good idea to have somebody in this role who's not a political. All right. And before I get into the markets, I am going to show you, I want you to know that there are only 70 people in my office. Okay. And that includes my administration staff, my 5 meteorologists, my IT staff. So there's 70 people in total. But this is the kind of stuff that we work on. So we're advisors to the Secretary of Sustainable Development, Food Loss and Waste, WASB report, Sustainability Coordinator, Ag Labor Coordinator, Biotech Coordinator for the department, Pest Management Policy. Some of you might know our OPMP office, which is the folks that represent kind of the producers' interests and concerns and the chemistries that they use to produce. And so we engage EPA and say, hey, EPA, here's how you should think about this. Endangered Species Act, how producers will respond, hey, here's how you should think about this. Okay, so pest management policy, energy and environmental policy. For those of you that know things like climate smart agriculture, the grant program, when you want to think about biofuel policy and GHG ratings under biofuel policy, a lot of the thinking behind that goes on in the Office of Energy and Environmental Policy. And then only somebody who really loves government would be excited about, though, risk assessment and cost benefit analysis. But it's an incredibly important program because when regs come through the department, somebody has to say, what are the real costs and what are the real benefits of this reg? Okay? Not whether it's a good idea to do it or not. Sometimes the costs outweigh the benefits of it. People still push it through, but we're telling you here's what the costs and benefits are. And then on top of this, which is not listed, is that I am the chair of the board of the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation Board of Directors, for which we will have a meeting next week. This is the board that looks through products being proposed or how the products operate and decides on expansions or changes in crop insurance policies. Okay, so this is what my office does. There are 70 of us. Then and the WASB group is a group that again puts out that monthly report, is completely apolitical, needs to be seen as apolitical, so that is a good reason why it exists within my office. Right? You want it to be seen as neutral, non-political in those reports. All right. So I'm willing to talk about any of that stuff and more as we go through. But very sincerely, I'm going to try and put a little bit, this is a kind of pushing together about 10 different presentations that I give over different topics. So if it looks a little disjointed, you know exactly why. I'm going to try and put in not just an outlook, here's where I think corn prices are going. Let's start to talk about what some of the overarching things are and what my concerns might be. And then we'll talk a little bit about livestock, talk a little bit about food price inflation. If we have time, we can talk about my concerns about the intersection of crop insurance and environmental policy. And we can bring these things together, all right? But I encourage you to ask questions if you have them along the way, if that's the way folks would like to have them. Okay, so I always like to remind folks and show them that, we're coming, we are seeing a precipitous decline. I used to show this graph to say, hey, prices were rising way before we had war in Ukraine. They were starting to rise in late 2020 as the Chinese came back into our market. We saw those commodity prices rise. We had some supply shocks around the world as well too. We had war in Ukraine that added a lot to wheat prices, but we've seen those commodity prices come down pretty sharply. And so I showed this graph to remind folks what we've observed in terms of prices falling into it so far. And also I'll show you kind of where we think prices are going to be for the next crop year as well too. And perhaps one of my concerns. All right. And when I look at this, there are some things which confuse me about where we're at in the market. And some things which, okay, this makes a lot of sense. I can see why prices are headed where they're at. So this is global stocks less China. And why do I not include China in this? Because Chinese stocks are both not accessible to the market and they're highly uncertain. We simply don't have very good information on what the Chinese are holding. Okay, so when I look at this, you can go, oh, okay, so we went through this period of lower corn stocks, we're building corn stocks, soybeans, obviously we're having a rebound in global supplies of soybeans. That's why we're seeing such price pressure. Rice, despite the fact that we have growing stocks, we'll talk a little bit about policy interventions there and what I have concerns about on a global scale. And then finally, wheat. I'm just confused about why wheat is so cheap and why wheat remains so cheap. But I don't have a good reason why from a fundamental standpoint, other than we've got a war going on and we don't have large global stocks. Okay, so we can talk a little bit about this, but I want to throw that out there and say some of this makes sense from the fundamentals about why we're seeing commodity prices soften, and some of this confuses me a bit, and I want to continue to keep an eye on it. All right. So to emphasize that point, we talked about how commodity prices are softening. This is our forecast as of Monday for where commodity prices will be for the coming crop. Okay, and you can see across the board declines in commodity prices for what I'm showing you here. And I think these two averages here are not just random averages. They're not random averages. They're a period of high commodity prices and then a period of pretty tight margins for producers. And then I'm showing you the last several years. Now I'm doing this purposely to contrast prices in those boom periods, which I say farm income was boom in terms of farm income being good, prices being strong for those commodities, and then a period of 5 years after that where margins were pretty tight. Okay, and then I'm showing you where we're at and declining commodity prices. And these are, again, pretty notable declines in commodity prices. You can see I calculate both the absolute difference and the percent difference going forward across the board. There's very little on the crop side which does not show a declining price going forward. Well, it's the individual marketing year for each of the crops. So for corn, it'd be this is the price going forward off of the next harvest, right? And so that's farther out than it is for winter wheat, because winter wheat, the new crop year, is already started. Did I get that right? Yeah. I'm sorry, I always get my crop years. Come on, the new crop year for wheat is already started, so we're already in there, but we're approaching the beginning of the marketing year for corn. So this is the crop that was growing this summer and will be marketed over the next year. And so those are really forward-looking prices for those crops. Okay, so take that chart that I was telling you, and that's where we're headed into. Okay, so, and again, I'm purposely showing these prices relative to those two previous periods because that's part of my statement about what concerns me. Okay, now this one is really archaic, but it is important for me because I have this question of is why doesn't the market care? This is about why doesn't the market care when you see a shock and see some flooding? Why doesn't the market care when it turns dry? Okay, the market has assessed supplies are ample for these crops. Wheat still confuses me, but this is implied volatility. What really this represents is, when you think about this, what it is it's a measure of any options. But the way to view this is how uncertain does the market feel the price is? How uncomfortable is it with price direction? How uncertain is it with price direction? So when you look at this one, clearly in 2022, in the height of the war with Russia and Ukraine, when it started, a lot of uncertainty. Where are things going to head? We don't know. But look at where corn is now. The white line being kind of an average measure of volatility, and that volatility tends to fall as the crop size is known. But volatility below average. The market feels very comfortable with where corn supplies are at. The market feels even more comfortable with where beans are at in terms of average supply and availability. I'm just telling you this as a way, does the market feel comfortable with where things are? Does it worry about shocks? It feels comfortable with supply. And finally, wheat. Despite the fact that we've got a war, an active war, despite the fact that we've got shrinking global supplies, the market's saying, my uncertainty is no greater than it is usually. That's what it is saying now. And you can see how high it went during the war when there's a lot of uncertainty. We've got a huge chunk of global trade in wheat in an area where there's active conflict. We still have a huge chunk of global wheat trade in an area of active conflict, but the market seems much more comfortable with about how the market has handled this subsequent to the invasion. Okay. But I would assume we've got a few producers in the audience, and everybody knows it's not just what I get for receipts, it's what it costs me to grow it. And this starts to get at what my concerns are. So when you look, it's not just the output prices, it's my input costs, and we have seen some softening of some input prices for overall production. So clearly with commodity prices falling, my cash receipts are falling. Now, what is it costing me to grow that crop? We have seen some things improve. Fertilizer. We might expect some things to improve. Think about your interest expense. Maybe. Folks expecting a Fed rate cut. Will we get it or not? But interest expenses have expected to decline, maybe a little bit, still higher than they were. But is it cheaper to fix your equipment? Is your labor cheaper than it used to be? Is your chemistry and your truck parts and maybe we're finally seeing some equipment costs decline? That's not a sign of good things. But you're saying from a cost side, those costs are not coming down as quickly as the outputs are coming down. So we're getting margin shrinking. How tight will those margins get? How tight will those margins get is an important issue and a concern for me.
You have a screen on typical.
I do have chemical costs, and it's a mix. I don't have it in a screen on it, but we do follow that, right? And some things you've seen a decline in, and certain other things, I mean, it's a real mix. The problem is it's not a mix when it comes to your output side. It's not a mix. We're down, right? And on the crop side, we're going to talk about that. But what I'm showing you here is we've been through this before. In terms of we go through a period of a jump in commodity prices, followed by input prices rising, taking this, then the market settles, you get back on track in production, input prices tend to remain stickier, and we go through a period of tight margins. I think the classic case is the one there in the middle, where we have a bump up in commodity prices, and that's why I showed you those price bands in the price chart. And then commodity prices fall. Input prices remain sticky, you get a cost price squeeze, and you go through an extended 5-year period where margins are tough, and the sector is pretty tough on the sector. Is that where we're headed now? Certainly seems like we're headed for pretty tight margins. The question is, how tough is it going to be? Right? How tough is it going to be? But honestly, as well, too, you have to note in this graph, it's a lot more common to run on a year with tight margins than it is on making a lot of money. That's not unusual. 2 or 3 years of making good money, 5 years of not making a whole lot. The question is, how rough does it get? How fast? Okay. Right now, at least you're entering a period where one look, like I got my colleagues at the Kansas City Fed, some of the information they post would say it looks pretty good in terms of balance sheets for producers, but they know that that's a backward-looking issue, not a forward-looking issue when it comes to those margins. Okay. So economists not known for their optimism. This concerns me. Okay, so this is one of my concerns. All right, And again, I think this is just a graphical display of this. This is from some of our colleagues at the University of Illinois. And it really is gross revenue, production costs, and this one's even old. It's deteriorated since I built this chart. When you look at this, that gray box is available for land costs and producer income. And I know we got some folks familiar with Illinois. Can you rent good land in Illinois for $200 an acre? Not even close, right? And so you're making money for a few years and you're making very little in the rest of them. And again, the question is where are we at? Are we going to go through a period of constraining margins for several years? And that's kind of, I think, one of the questions that we want to, if we soft landing, or is it an aggressive, we're going to end up with rough for a couple of years? I think it's a fair question. So you've already seen our look at farm income. This farm income is from earlier this year, does not reflect those lower commodity prices, yet lower commodity prices that I tell you. So when you look at this, you are talking something back in the range of more normal, long run farm income. I would suggest we'll be moving lower, perhaps, given the commodity prices. It's certainly a possibility. So again, farm income, you have a couple of really good years, got the lean years coming maybe. But anyway, that's one of my concerns again when I put it into the farm income perspective. And part of this, and I think it's worth noting here, we have had several government interventions into the farm sector over the last couple of years. And there's been a lot of uncertainty. It's been a rough couple of years of trying to forecast. So you got here market facilitation payments related to trade friction with China. Then you got COVID payments related to COVID disruptions. And now you see kind of the pullback on those direct government payments, and you're getting more dollars from the market, right? I think that while a dollar from the market and a dollar from the government spend the same, I think if you ask producers, they'd rather get it from the market. Spends the same, but they'd like to get it from the market. But we look forward on this as well, too, because of some of the ways that things like our ARC and PLC payments work. Those government payments are not going to rise going forward when you talk about some of the direct payments, the ARC and the PLC payments. Okay, so let's talk about now. Are we good so far?
So I don't know if you agree, or
Well, remember the way some of those ARC, remember some of the way the ARC and PLC payments function. And I don't think 26 is going to be the year. I think you're going to have to wait out some low prices before those. And I got some colleagues in here that are probably paying closer attention to recent estimates. But think about the way those payments are calculated, and they're based upon the prior years, right? And they're by 5-year average, and the calculation is done the prior year and not paid until October the following year. And so that was my point of showing that graph, which is you shouldn't expect in 24 or 25, and then maybe in 26, then in 27. But remember, by that time, you're 4 years into some pretty low commodity prices as well, too. All right, then you'll notice I'm not going to talk about the farm bill at all. I'm happy to take questions, but I don't have anything here on my slide for it at all. All right, that was a bit pessimistic. I admit, I'm even depressed myself now. But let's talk a little bit about some of these commodity markets where I think there are some interesting policy mechanisms that we can talk about as we I'm going to kind of run through commodities, and I'm going to kind of throw in, as I run through some of the commodity markets, what it is that, maybe some of the policy interventions that I think are interesting as we go through them. Okay, so just reported on this, soybean acres, NASS used to not do an acreage change until October. Last year, they moved it up to September. This year, they moved it up all the way to August. Why is that important? Because I don't think the trade yet knew how to digest what we observed by reporting both acreage and yield. So subjective yield reporting by subjective, I mean farm-based surveys for yield and FSA data for acres. And so in this, part of the reason why you saw a decline in soybean prices coming out of the report is you found an extra 1 million acres of soybeans. Okay? 1 million acres of soybeans reported in the FSA data that wasn't there when we did the June acreage report for surveying farmers. Okay, so a little bit of difference. That could just be noise from between what farmers reported and what FSAA reported. Okay, so part of the reason you saw a sharp price decline on Monday for soybeans was this. The other part of it was that not only did we produce more, but the rest of the world produced more as well too. So when you look at that soybean yield, a record high soybean yield, that's part of the story obviously, but a well above trend soybean. Okay, so good supplies of soybeans, you saw growing global carryout. Here's the underlying problem that I see for soybeans going forward. What I've got here is South American production. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay. See, growing. And then the black line is Chinese trade demand. Okay, you can take 6, 8, 10 million metric tons of additional production out of South America if you're getting the same kind of growth from Chinese demand. If that demand starts to slow, you've got a problem. Okay, and Chinese growth in demand was, we underestimated the growth in that demand for almost a decade, but it is slowing. And therein creates a problem of, we've got big supplies, how are we going to absorb this? Okay, so on the soybean side, you can take those kinds of increases in production out of South America if you've got a home for it. We're not very export competitive. This is our accumulation of exports over time this year relative to prior years, and this is a theme in both corn and soybeans, and maybe generally speaking, is our lack of export competitiveness. We can talk about what some of the fundamental reasons for our lack of export competitiveness are, but here in soybeans, you can obviously see that our export inspections pretty low relative to some of our previous years, and I'll note that 2019 and 18-19 are both years with trade friction with China. Okay, that's why those export inspections were slow. We had trade friction with China before we started to resolve that in 2020, and prices started to move. But there is, at least from a policy standpoint, a silver lining for beans. We can talk about how big it is or its impact, is that we can see increasing use for soybean oil into some biofuel production. Okay, so biofuel policies, we can talk about what the underlying function of demand is here. This is a government constructed policy, so therefore it is a government constructed market, and that's what's driving it. But you can see a move from traditional biodiesel being added to by renewable diesel to produce distillate replacements for soybean oil. So this looks good. This says, hey, soybean oil growing over time. That means we should need more domestic crush, and we should produce some more soybean oil, and so therefore we're creating a domestic demand, and maybe we worry less about exporting it in competition with China. But here starts to hint at an emerging problem, which is this is pounds of it going in, and its percent share in the overall use for production of biodiesel. So we say, hey, there's a growing demand for feedstocks for biodiesel production, but it's not coming from soybean oil. That growing demand, but it's not coming from soybean oil. Feedstocks for biodiesel, you can look and see where those feedstocks are, and then you can see feedstock imports. What are we importing in order to produce that biodiesel? Note that these two were for the first quarter of this year, so you can get a sense that 2024 is growing. You can come out here and see the same, and one of the big things is either canola oil imported from Canada, okay, or used cooking oil, a lot of it imported from China. Okay, so when we think about GHG emission scoring, greenhouse gas emission scoring, the current model of greenhouse gas emission scoring says used cooking oil has a very favorable GHG framework. And therefore, it is very appealing to use as a feedstock for biodiesel production. More appealing than soybean oil because you're getting bigger GHG savings for which you can then get more low carbon fuel credits out of California. What is used cooking oil? I'm asking you because I don't know. What is used cooking oil? How used is used cooking oil? How do you define what used cooking oil is? It's not very clear. When you do a census report for imports for used cooking oil, it says, well, it's inedible and it's been heated. Okay, that's not a very precise definition for what is used cooking oil. How much used cooking oil is there out there in the world? Could we collect more used cooking oil? Could instead of, nobody here runs a restaurant, take offense, I don't know about this. If I replace my fire grease every 2 days instead of every 3 days, I've now got 50% more used cooking oil. Okay? And we have seen periods of time where unused palm, used cooking oil prices exceed palm oil prices. Used cooking oil prices exceed palm oil prices for sure. Well, I'm going to be turning my fire grease over every 5 minutes so I can make money doing it. Right? And so there's a question. What do you think UCO is, and what is UCO? Right? So I think that there's a policy uncertainty here in what people envision UCO is and what UCO actually is in the marketplace. And so you see this kind of growth in demand, and we've seen states like California now proposing a soybean oil used to produce distillate replacements, so biodiesels. Okay, that's going to increase UCO demand. Does that increase in UCO demand have any effect on how much palm oil flows into China in order to fry food? As an economist, I would think it does. Okay, so how much does it matter? So this is a real question here, which is, where is that UCO coming from? And is that the UCO that you think it is? Or do you envision what UCO is? Right? 20 years ago, this was stuff that you had to pay at a restaurant to get rid of, and maybe that was in order to get somebody to clean out the stuff that they use it in a chemical process, it may be cleaned or something. Right? Now it has value. Now it created value, now I'm causing a churn in that market. So again, I think that this is one of the things where it hasn't, the increase in demand hasn't materialized within the soybean oil market in the way you might have anticipated. Right. Then you go and you think about, okay, and I'm mixing in all my points around here. One of the presentations I'm actually getting a lot of requests for is competition with China, and can we disengage ourselves from China? Can we not disengage ourselves from China? What does competition with China look like? And I'll tell you, there's world soybean imports and China's share. I don't observe another market immediately obvious to me to replace China from a disengagement standpoint. Okay? And I show you the prices on the right because just to say, even the Chinese view the soybean market as quite open. Those prices all align. You know, internal and external prices and origins for China match up. It functions more of an open market than other commodities. So it's not immediately obvious to me there's an alternative, the Chinese market. Now let's switch to talking about corn. That's the one that price that's way above the others is the internal price for corn in China. And that works out to something when you start adjusting for freight, $50 a metric ton. Okay, so if the corn is outside of China, now this isn't cost of moving it, outside of China and inside of China, the price is $50 a metric ton difference. They're importing 20 million metric tons a year. That's $1 billion worth of value created by being able to get it into China. Okay, so the Chinese market, though, overall is a fairly small amount of the market, but given that they used to be occasional corn exporters, it's become an important market for corn trade. Okay. But the Chinese are also diversifying in who they buy from. This is a graph. Everything in red is a U.S. product. So if that feeds or could feed like corn-like products. Green is a mix of barley that is not U.S. barley, Ukrainian corn, and some other sorghums. But that big change in color you see at the end is Brazil. Brazil has displaced us to a significant amount within the Chinese market, even as the Chinese are buying more grain. Okay. The Chinese have gone out and removed SPS, phytosanitary restrictions that they have on Brazilian corn, to be able to diversify the sources in which they buy corn, and that's Brazil. Okay. So now Brazil has become a big export competitor to us within the Chinese market. Corn acres in the United States. So let's talk a little bit domestically about corn acres. As you can see, coming down a little bit from last year's high. Last year, folks asked me what surprised you about the market? Last year, not for this current acres. Last year, they asked me, and I said, how responsive U.S. farmers were to some of the things going on in the market. And I was a bit impressed by virtue of the fact that we planted a little bit more corn, a little bit more wheat, even though wheat area had been declining, because those happen to be two products for which we didn't have or had uncertain access from the Ukrainian market. So I said, hey, farmers showed some good flexibility in light of those prices. We should always make sure we allow the farmers to have that flexibility. And so we saw that bump up in corn and maybe return to a little bit lower corn acres, and we lost about 700,000 acres in the report on Monday relative to where we thought we were. Okay, and that's part of the reason why you saw prices for corn up a little bit. Also, we reduced global supplies. Okay, so a different story than in soybeans. Corn yields at about trend, still a record high, maybe a little bit above trend. Some big state numbers for some states in terms of overall yield, increases in production. But now that China is buying a lot of corn from Brazil, we are also the ones that are kind of stocking the grain around the world. Okay, maybe that provides a pricing opportunity to do a few more exports this year, maybe. But we are probably, we are the folks that are going to be doing a lot of the stocking of the excess grain. Now, part of me says that's because we're a more efficient grain storer than the Brazilians are. Okay, we're a more efficient grain store. Maybe this is just natural. If farmers can get paid to store, maybe that makes sense. The question I think we have is that we saw farmers holding a disproportionately large share of stocks in our June report. On-farm stocks is a bigger proportion than off-farm stocks, which concerns me a little bit. The data don't tell us whether that grain is priced or not, but I do have some concerns about farmers holding unpriced grain into a big crop. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about winter wheat. I'm from Iowa. What do I know about wheat? Not a whole lot. All right, so I'm going to admit that up front, but let's talk a little bit about winter wheat acres from what we've observed. Okay, so again, farmers' responsiveness was pretty good. I liked the farmers. I was impressed with their responsiveness to the need that the market signaled about the need to produce additional wheat and corn, given the uncertainties in the Black Sea. This is what we've observed from overall wheat acres. And a good rebound, we had, last year, for the prior years, of very low wheat yields, a good rebound in winter wheat production. So from our own standpoint, good wheat production in the United States, but overall, when one looks around the world, some decline in overall global stocks. Again, why is wheat so cheap? I'm looking for an answer to that. That's not a rhetorical question. So if somebody wants to say, why is wheat so cheap? I'd love to hear it. Why is wheat so cheap?
So Russia was here for this market here and what was done. 15%.
So here you go. Here's your two huge Russian wheat crops, and still a big Russian wheat crop here. You're right that the Russians have been selling at a very cheap price out of the Black Sea. The Ukrainians have been pushing those stocks out at a surprisingly good level as well, too. Early on, I was quite skeptical about whether that Ukrainian grain would move. Right? I was a bit skeptical. I'm sorry, maybe it wasn't a creative enough thing. Overland routes into Europe, supplies out of Constanza down, so other ways to move this. Of course, the Ukrainian farmer was taking it all on the basis for them, unfortunately, right? Any additional transportation costs into a world market comes at the expense of the Ukrainian farmer in terms of the price that we get for their grain, but they moved a lot more than I thought they could. Okay, but they've got themselves down to a more normal stock level. The Russians had two huge wheat crops in a row. They've been exporting and selling at a very low level, setting the price at a very low level, and moving a lot of grain.
I don't think all of the stuff. I have that.
Well, they've got a lot more grain than average too, right? I mean, and that is a question. This will come to my export controls statement as well too. We don't do that in the United States, right? And I think it's important to remember that. We don't put export controls on our products. Other countries do in an effort to control the market. All right. I'm going to back up a little bit, and this is just to reiterate my statement about trainings did better than I expected in terms of overall exports of grain. Okay, there was some real concern that they would run out of storage because they couldn't move the grain, and yet they were harvesting the grain when it came to 2022, when the harvest was coming in. At an active war zone, where are you going to put the grain if you can't move it? They've been pretty successful in moving it, but grain production is going to rationalize to what prices are available to them. So, you know, an expectation here that those exports will tail off as kind of they move the grain that was backlogged, production is going to fall, and yet we're still talking about 30, my black line is the percent, 30% of wheat trade coming out of an active war zone. Why is wheat so cheap? The mills make it all out. I don't think it's the mills making the money. I get you. I don't think it's that. And I will say, you know, one of the things we've done also is in this, and I'll talk about this if we get to it. I'm loving the interaction. Food's different. We didn't sanction food. We didn't sanction grain. We didn't sanction fertilizer. Now, early on, you would see some movement and uncertainty as the sanctions got piled on. But we didn't sanction grain. We didn't sanction fertilizer. No, food's different, let it flow. That's a very U.S. way of thinking about this as well, too. Food is different. Let the food flow. Okay, so winter wheat yields. And here's the state-by-state winter wheat yields. And I'm really only showing you the state-by-state winter wheat yields because so the way to read this is the yield is on the top. The change from the previous year is on the bottom. So we've got some big changes over last year when conditions were pretty poor across the state. And if there's a pound, it's a record yield. And why do I show you this? Because it's more important even for spring wheats. But you got some records in South Dakota there who have some record yields. And when I show you some spring wheats, I just want you to remember you've got some record yields there in a few states. Most importantly, in this case, is South Dakota. This is a graph that my colleagues at NASS often show, which is the pre-report estimate of what the yield will be, and the red box is what the actual yield is. Okay, and so when you look at this, you say, okay, the actual estimate of yield has risen over time, and the uncertainty about where the market thinks those yields at will narrow. Okay, still at the upper end of the trade range expectations, and by pointing out the record high yield in a couple of places, I'm trying to hint to you what we're seeing in some of the other spring wheat yields. Now, when it comes to yield estimates right now for winter wheat, it's actually what's called an objective yield survey. It's actually going out into the field and physically measuring yields. When it comes to spring wheats, that crop isn't far enough along, so you're asking farmers, what do you think that yield is? What do you think the yield on your wheat is? That's a very different process. And it is a very different process if you think you're getting a record yield that you've never observed. That's hard to do. It's hard to think about, well, I haven't seen this yield before. What is the yield? Is it a lot bigger? A little bigger than I've seen before? A lot bigger? So when you come in here, you've got so far in other spring wheat yields, some record numbers in North Dakota, Minnesota. And I think that when it comes to this next step, on the trade's ability or our ability and our swing in our yields, I think at the moment we've got record yields in spring wheat, and farmers are unsure how to calibrate to a record yield. Right? It's not a physical survey of the land. It's asking the farmer what they think at this point. And what they think is uncertain because it's tough. when it's something you've never observed before? Okay, really quiet. Are we doing okay? I didn't hear a yes, but I didn't hear a no. We doing all right? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. All right, we're gonna talk about livestock a little bit, just a little bit. Is that okay? You good? All right. I don't want to tell you things that you guys aren't interested in. I'm using you as public therapy, like I said. I'm showing you my concerns about what's going on. Livestock. Oh, I got my hog price. It's not stock. Something happened to my. The cattle number should be 195, and the swine number should be 57.5. I apologize for that. I will fix it when it gets posted. My point that I wanted to make on this one is you got record high cattle prices. You got record high cattle prices. We got a little bit of softening in the swine price. Is that a demand side issue? I looked at others to say, here's an honest question. Has the cross price elasticity between beef and other meats fallen? That is okay. So the question is, do people perceive beef differently than other proteins? And some of my colleagues here would say, yes. I am probably among those people. I really like beef. I don't necessarily like chicken. I like pork. Don't necessarily consider those true supplements. I want beef. I want beef. We've seen record high cattle prices. Okay, and again, I apologize. I will fix those numbers in there. We've seen a lot of volatility in egg prices related to HPAI. Whenever you see our egg price forecast, it assumes no HPAI going forward. We don't forecast HPAI. Okay, but the cattle price that's up there missing is above 190. We're just looking at record high cattle price. Why are we doing this? This is my only cattle chart. We can talk about a lot of things when it comes to cattle related to this one chart, which is we are in a contraction phase of the cattle cycle. Now, some of you may know I didn't get my July cattle report, which I'm actually rather upset about. NASS did not have a budget to do the cattle report. I think it's not my NASS colleagues' fault either, but it comes at a very inopportune time because I'm trying to back into this now, what I'm observing through things like what's going on in heifer slaughter. What are farmers telling me? And so far, what I'm hearing a lot is the difference between retaining those animals and rolling the dice on making the money in the future is taking the back seat to take the money and run now. Not yet observing a turn. Anyone want to argue that they're seeing a turn and we're retaining heifers in order to breed the herd out? Or somebody want to tell me if I'm wrong about why? Anybody retaining it? Or is this it's like a secret? I don't want to tell anybody retaining heifers. All right. But see, understand, and we've gone kind of through a difficult period here in the cattle market as well, too, which is 2 years ago, we were still trying to work through those COVID animals. 3 years ago, we had some shutdowns in the supply chain for animal slaughter, and the sensitivity of the discussion about who's making money and who isn't making money was very different than it is now. Okay? So this is going to linger for a while. All right? So does this mean, this means this is going to linger for a while. So unless we have some of the demand side impact, we're looking at good cattle prices going forward with excess slaughter capacity. Excess slaughter capacity. Who is going to get kicked out of the slaughter game? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about trade. Can somebody tell me how much time I got left?
Yeah, 28 minutes.
28 minutes. Okay, we can definitely do trade in less than 28 minutes. Then we'll move on from there. So part of my comment about trade here is, I was telling you, we're a little less trade competitive than I think, we're having a little bit of tough trade competition when it comes to the South Americans. All right. And when you look through here, exports, imports, you can talk about normally we have a trade surplus in agriculture and we've got maybe a record large trade deficit. Now, I know as an economist, I'm not supposed to care about trade deficits. I know I'm not supposed to, but I do. I'm sorry, it's an emotional thing. I'm not supposed to care about trade deficits, but I can explain to you why trade is good and we're importing things counter seasonally. When I was a kid in Iowa in the wintertime, you couldn't get anything at the grocery store at 5 p. But now you can get whatever you want at IB in the wintertime, and isn't agricultural trade great? Yeah, I get it. As an economist in the rational party says, it's great. Doesn't mean I like it from an emotional standpoint, but we're running a pretty big trade deficit here. And I can say a big part of this is the fact, at least on the export side, that fall in commodity prices and the Chinese choosing different origins. So, this sort of, I'm going to talk to you more about trade. It could very well be I did something. Let's talk a little bit about, I know, I wasn't going to talk about livestock. Let's talk about Prop 12. So I'll come back to trade. All right. Does everybody know what Prop 12 is in terms of agriculture, of swine markets? So Prop 12 is a proposition passed by California that says you must give the sow 24 square feet of space, then the hogs she produced can be sold in California. The meat that the hogs that are produced from her hogs can be sold in California. And if she doesn't have 24 square feet of space, you can't sell those hogs in California. Okay. Now this started out by California doing this on cage-free eggs. All right. You want to sell your eggs in California, they have to come from chickens who lay those eggs cage-free. Okay. And what you see is you see a jump in prices of California eggs that reflect that cost, right? And this is an evolution here. And tell me if I'm thinking about this wrong. When I thought about this, I say, hey, you can have a layer farm and you can send all those eggs to California. It's easy to segment eggs, send those eggs to California and make the Californians pay for it. They want cage-free eggs, sell them cage-free eggs. Pigs starts to become a little more difficult here. Do you have dedicated facilities to slaughter those animals and send them on to the market? Do you have specific slaughter facilities, specific days within those slaughter facilities? How do you segment this market? Can those Californians be made to pay for this? And if so, should we care? Should the Californians, they're paying for it, and should we care? That's what they want. You're selling the Californians what they want. And there are costs. There are costs to doing this, and these costs that you've estimated are all along the supply chain. First, you got to provide the sow that extra space. That's not all of it, right? You've got to track that meat. You've got to slaughter it in a different facility. You've got to keep it segmented. The person that you sell it to that's going to put it in the grocery store has to have all the paperwork and source that pork that they need. And so you can see cost increases, not just passed on that sow cost. Sow cost plus tracking, sow cost plus tracking, plus more tracking. And there are costs associated with that add up along the wholesale, on the swine part, the wholesale part, and the retail part. And so you can see this is the price of pork ribs in California and everywhere else. Okay, so you can see who's paying for it? All the Californians are paying for it. Okay, so in this case, at least most of it has been passed on to California consumers through higher prices. And I know we've got colleagues in the room who have studied this even more than we have looked at. You can see the same thing for pork loins. Now, if I was to show you ground pork, there'd be no difference. Because ground pork isn't a compliant cut. The ground pork can come from any animal. So all the costs associated with this have to fall on the cuts that comply. And not only that, I would argue not fall on the cuts for which there are not good substitutes. You can only charge so much for fresh bacon when you can get pre-cooked bacon. Right? And pre-cooked bacon doesn't have to comply. So you get all the costs associated with this have to fall on certain cuts of the animal in California. And as a result, prices are much higher. What are Californians doing? They're consuming less pork. This is basically California's share of U.S. pork consumption. It's a natural reaction. Higher prices mean less pork consumption. So if you were a supporter of this, animal welfare was the real benefit to what you see as animal welfare, betterment of the sow, or is the fact that there's now a whole bunch less hog feeding? Was that your objective? right? And so from that standpoint, it has been effective in reducing corn consumption in California through higher prices. So now you're starting to talk about this is affecting folks outside of California, if you think about it that way, but the Californians are paying for it. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about trade. So I showed you trade, and I can still get through the trade in the probably 12 minutes I have left.
You got 18.
Okay, so I want to put trade in a larger context as well too. I showed you kind of how the Chinese view certain products. They view those products where you see very low trade dependency as being critical food commodities within the country. They don't see soybeans as being a critical food commodity within the country, and that is therefore why they are so willing to take a large trade dependency. All right, they are very sensitive about food availability, incredibly sensitive about it. That's why you see corn, rice, and wheat being very low trade dependency. But if I took beans out of there, you would see an increase in some things like corn and even wheat also trending upward. It's just not noticeable in the light of soybeans. This does not make the Chinese, this makes the Chinese nervous. And they will talk about self-sufficiency. But they are still very self-sufficient in these relatively speaking, but the Chinese are sensitive to imports of these products and manage it very heavily, which is why you see the internal price of corn being so much higher than the actual price of it. They manage it pretty heavily. China has become less of a trading partner with us. Those 2 years where they get down to fifth is when we had trade friction with China. They come back, kind of implement phase one trade agreement, and now they've diversified the sources from which they're buying, and commodity prices are starting to fall, and now Canada and Mexico are our two top trading partners. That's good, and it's good to have good trading partners close to home as well. Good. That's a good thing.
There's no real significant difference there today.
The tariff. So, and this, we get in a whole discussion about transparency into the Chinese market, right? So in theory, many of these tariffs remain. Are they paying? Are people importing corn into China paying? And then on top of that, there is a tariff rate quota that says anything below 7.2 million metric tons is cheap. If you want to import the next metric ton, it gets expensive. There's a tariff rate quota. First 7.2 million metric tons cheap. Everything above that, pretty expensive. And yet they're importing 20 million metric tons. Is somebody paying that tariff? And if somebody's not paying the tariff, who's the somebody not paying the tariff? I mean, somebody else wants, besides me, want to shout out where they're paying the tariff?
State trading.
Oh, okay, there's a good idea, right? Okay, so that makes it, so when I said there's $1 billion to be made, extracted from the market.
How good you're in for state trading enterprise. They you don't know whether they're paying or it doesn't matter.
Well, you're moving it, it's a state-owned enterprise. If you are paying it, you're moving it from this pocket to this pocket.
Yeah, they're not an economically rational player in the market.
They're not an economic, but they're good at what they do.
Well,
Yeah, economically rational,
the CCP.
market-based. They operate in a different functional form. I don't think they're irrational. I think they're rational under the context of which they operate.
Like you said, they're not economically, yes, they're politically rational.
Okay, fair enough. All right, another thing which isn't necessarily helping us and kind of adds to this, you got any comments? I got to throw a little bit in here. The dollar exchange rate, dollar's been pretty strong. That makes it pretty tough for us to export competitive as well too, right? And so I got to put that in there. I got to throw in some pure economics. Exchange rates make it difficult for us to be export competitive. But getting back a little bit to my question about getting a lot of these sessions going and folks asking me to talk about competitive competition with China trade competitive, statecraft. I remind folks, food is not like AI, electric vehicles, computer chips. We don't treat it the same way. We don't treat food the same way. And we enjoy a aggregate non-trade deficit in China versus a pretty big trade surplus at these lower levels. A trade surplus from China, but that doesn't mean it's easy for us to decouple from China. Because as I showed you for some commodities, tell me what the alternative market is, right? And so we have some mutual dependencies here with China that we have to remember, have to remind each other, right? Some mutual dependencies.
Well, they're also dependent on the competition law. So they have to find some.
Mutual dependencies, right? And we can talk about all the reasons during the trade war, you had African swine fever, you had this. So again, there's some mutual dependencies here that we need to keep in mind. Okay, but food is different. Listen, I show this chart when I go to talk to people in the Department of Defense. I say, food is different. We don't treat food like we treat everything else. So this is like human needs, the scale of human needs. And, your new BMW or your TikTok account is up there in your self-esteem. You can live without that. You can't live without food. And by food, I mean not white wine. When I'm in DC, I tell them, look, I know the white wine ran out, there'd be like social unrest after 10 days. But, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about food. And for some folks, that's a really critical issue. And I bring this up, we talked a little bit about Russia and its stockholding and how much grain it has. Prices for rice have been moving in the opposite direction of every other ag commodity. And why is that? It's because we've got states which treat food trade differently than we do in the United States. India has a policy of producing a lot of food and then exporting it, except when they get uncomfortable and then they slap export controls on it. So you become a fair size of what is a thinly traded global market in rice trade. But when you need it, you slap on an export control and you transmit all of that volatility and uncertainty into the rest of the market. And I'll remind you where a lot of that price goes. It goes to some of the most vulnerable consumers in the world. We don't do that in the United States. We don't think about putting export controls on our grains. We don't say, boy, there's a war raging in the Black Sea. Should we put export controls on wheat? We don't do that, right? So we do think about food differently, and we don't treat food as a negative tool. We do treat food as a positive tool. I think we got to be pragmatic when it comes to things like food aid and delivering food for those most vulnerable consumers. And tell me another commodity that we are great at export that we will also teach you how to produce in your own country to substitute for our export. We don't do that for electric vehicles. We don't do that for chips, but we do it for food because we view food differently, right? Okay. Food price inflation. Okay, I'm gonna make you make a choice. So you're gonna have to be interactive. Food price inflation or crop insurance, and my anxiety about crop insurance. I hear one for crop insurance. Anybody else for crop? Anybody want to talk about food price inflation? All right, we'll come back to it. Okay, so let's talk about crop insurance. Throw this up. You got to remember what the stated objectives are for crop insurance. And I know I have my RMA colleagues in the room, and so this is my own personal anxiety. All right, so objectives of the federal crop insurance, you can see them right up there. Federal crop insurance, reason for existing, and we can talk about the things that have changed over time. So we had an increase in crop enrollment under crop insurance, and then a more recent, really quick expansion in pasture, rangeland, and forage index product. So a new product that expands and provides additional coverage that people like and they join in. You can see the growth in PRF in terms of overall insured acres and liability. So really taking off as that product expands. Folks decide that this is a good product for them to manage some risk. Livestock crop insurance also taking off. Bigger than I think almost anyone would have expected several years ago. Some of these products, so this is dairy, swine, cattle. So there's a lot in here. but livestock products taking off as well too. So the amount of things being covered within federal crop insurance expanding pretty rapidly over the last couple of years and in phases. So you have growth in the crop program early on as you make some changes to the subsidy rate, where folks want to participate. Then you get things like PRF, pasture range land and forage, expands again. You get livestock and it expands again. So you got an expansion of the amount of things covered under crop insurance. Actuarially sound. Now I'm going to put this up there for a reason. I'm not going to go over this in great detail. Actuarially sound. So the rates have to reflect the risk of the product. Okay, actuarially sound. This isn't designed to pay out more than it brings in aggregate. It's designed to be actuarially sound. And this is where I start to reveal some of my anxiety about the intersection. So when I talk about this, I talk about in Iowa. They're in the winter time. There's intersections of gravel roads in the middle of nowhere. In the wintertime, it doesn't matter. I can see somebody coming a mile away down the gravel road in the middle of wintertime. I can't when the corn's growing very, very high. So I approach each intersection with caution during the height of the growing season because they are uncontrolled intersections in the middle of Iowa in the countryside. Uncontrolled intersections. So here I have concerns about forcing climate policy and risk management tools together without some serious thought consideration. Bringing these two things together, just mashing them together. And so encourage. I know what they're after. I know what they need, but I tend to facilitate, allow. Let the farmer decide best practice. Mixed risk management. When I was a kid, I had one of those plates. Those plates with the dividers in them? I didn't like my food touching. I don't like my risk management and my environmental climate, my conservation policies touch it. I like to be able to visibly observe them. And so this is part of what I have as a bit of a concern for crop insurance. And I'll tell you just as an example. Pandemic cover crop program. Are the folks familiar with the pandemic cover crop program? Right? $5 you could get for planting a cover crop. Folks familiar with this? Offered by RMA. Okay. Now, I'll say I like the RMA did this. It's a signal simply to say, you can do this. I think the signal was lost at some folks think that you couldn't do cover crops or there was a problem with cover crops and maintaining your crop insurance. So if the $5 merely says, okay, they wouldn't be giving me $5 if I'm not supposed to do this. That's a good signal. But if any producer thinks that the cover crop this year, if you haven't been doing it, somehow reduces your risk, I think they're wrong. They haven't been doing it. I pay out.
Do you think that the use of cover crops has increased the amount of indemnity payments in Kansas like exponentially?
Okay, so you're getting me towards my it has it. So the difference is between the use of cover crops as they exist over many years and the impact of cover crops when I do it for the first time are two different things. All right? Right? And so when you look, this is journal articles based upon test plots where you're doing it for the first time. Okay, and yeah, I know this is like very controlled environment, but I think as producers, is there a learning curve to doing new practices? Is there? Is there a learning curve to doing new practices? Or does it instantly result in a improvement? And if so, why weren't you doing it before? Okay, so the issue here is crop insurance is a year-by-year decision. Okay, and if you weren't doing it before, this suggests your first year might not be so ideal. So if that is the case, and we are incentivizing people to plant cover crops who haven't planted cover crops before, what are we doing in terms of being actuarially sound? Right. Now, if you tell me, okay, no, I'm not going to base it on whether you did it this year or not. I'm going to base it on whether you did it 5 of the last 7. That's a different story. I think there are benefits to cover crops over the long run, obviously, right? You have improvements in soil fertility. Here's the look, it matters what your cropping system is. The last thing you want to do is encourage producers to plant a cover crop when they know it'll be detrimental to the actual crop that they're planting, because somehow it cuts them a break on their crop insurance. Right? So when you think about this, you don't force these things together in a very ad hoc way. You think through it and say, how do we allow producers to make these decisions and transition to these practices that decouples it from a bad decision making in this year to encourage longer run decision making. But then my question becomes, doesn't that go into your APH anyway? Sure. No, but you understand what I'm saying? And so I just, again, I'm telling you 5 minutes. It produces some anxiety for me to think about really shoving these things together. Makes me be very thoughtful about how you bring these 2 pieces together. Okay. All right, so I am done. So I skipped over food price inflation. That's okay. I think you're all well aware of food price inflation. Okay? You're all well aware of that. But here's some of the stuff that I didn't even talk about the Farm Bill. All right? I didn't even talk about it. You can talk about it if you want. I didn't even talk about it. My opening point was crop margins are going to be much tighter. How much tighter? I think there is some thought, some anxiety that things could get pretty tight pretty fast. That is a concern for me. Are we going to come back a year from now? Not that Joey might be back after my not so happy presentation, but if I was here a year from now, would we be talking about really tough conditions for a year? And if you're kind of digging into that cash reserve that you built up over the last couple of years, that's a real concern. And it's a concern within the discussion of the Farm Bill as well, too, right? Clearly, the Farm Bill, one of the discussion points about the Farm Bill is addressing those reference prices, which don't account for increases in input prices, the inflation associated with input prices in the way that they might anticipate. Okay, so that this does relate to the Farm Bill discussion. Those narrowing margins are a key feature of things that folks would like to add to the Farm Bill. Struggling with export competitiveness. I can tell you, the Chinese aren't buying as much from us, they fall into third. I can explain a lot of what's happening by market fundamentals. Does it probably account for all of it? Probably not all of it, but most of it I can explain by market fundamentals. We are just not very export competitive. Okay? All of it? No. Most of it? Probably. Market fundamentals. Already talked about trade with China. Biofuels policy is a driver of veg oil markets, but not just U.S. policy. We are engaged in some international dialogues about measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And for those of you very interested in this, we can get into a discussion about, I think there is I don't think we yet have the precision necessary to really implement these things without being really thoughtful that we don't cause unintended consequences. Okay, I don't think we have the ability to measure those things so precisely that we can just point to that measurement and be satisfied with policy making. I'm glad you all agree that the cattle cycle doesn't appear to return. I hope to get my January cattle report. We'll see. State level animal welfare, we talked about it, but I'll also note that you talk about eggs, easy to segment. Pork, harder to segment. California has asked for an exemption to the Clean Air Act to change the locomotives which operated in state. They asked the EPA for an exemption for the locomotives that operate within its state. Do trains operate just within one state? No. So it's becoming, eggs easy to segment, pork harder to segment, trains nearly impossible to segment. And therefore, you're starting to see decisions within California that go beyond the borders of the state. And if we had 2 or 3 more hours, not 1 or 2, 2 or 3, we can start talking about Endangered Species Act and other things associated. Okay. And with that, I think, question. All right.
I've got a couple of questions, just completely, I just want to make sure. You talk about the exports to China, not importing. And USDA came out on Monday with the report, they increased exports by 25 million metric tons. And that's after we're at the lowest export rate since 2019, and also we're 150 million bushels less than last year. So how did they increase by 25 million metric tons?
So you're saying, by what are they changing these exports? Well, first of all, we'll put your prices down and not become a little bit more export competitive for the rest of the year. That's not a good thing. It's not as if exports are being driven by some magical demand. It's that we're finally pushing prices down enough in order to be able to make those exports. All right. So that's part of the story, right? You got to move it. You got to move that grain or store it.
So why not? Why not keep it at the same and pull the Band-Aid off and just go ahead and, I mean, it almost seemed like that they were artificial keeping that up there to make it look better. But that's a question that the brokers are having. This just didn't make sense with the lowest exports we've had. But I do know this is futuristic. This is what we're looking at. The other question I have is, what is the percentage? Have you ever taken the percentage of surveys sent out to farmers and the surveys returned?
Yeah, and so if anybody here who's an academic involved in survey response, you think this is a tremendous survey response, but it's like 60 or 70% response. But it remains at, I'd like to be 100, right? But people that do surveys, that's an amazing number for people that do surveys. But it is something that we at USDA and my NASA colleagues and I have to continually make the case that this is important for producers. We have to show the value. And I remind producers that, and I tell the story about the producer who only called me when prices went down. So he only called me about half the time, right? And that's okay, I get it. There's a very real impact that the producer can see. They don't see the fact that ADM, Cargill, Bunge, Costco know a lot more than they do. And so the more abstract value is this levels the playing field. And the whole reason this report exists is to level that playing, right? And so for me, we need to make that constant pitch that, yeah, you may not like this one report, but there's still a market. In the absence of this report, there's an information asymmetry that happens. Does that kind of get at it?
Yeah, it's just producers I'm around usually follow for the survey.
Yeah, and they get surveyed a lot. They get surveyed a lot, right? Generally speaking, I think USDA enjoys a better relationship with its constituencies than many government agencies. But it's something we constantly have to prove that it's worth that time. And it's on us.
As you mentioned, this, I think this September, the objectives will go along with farm surveys that I'm contracted forward to see that. That's
Yeah.
Gas data on site, on the ground, and go with the farmers. Closer to harvest.
Well, we used to go out in August as well, but it's too early. Tell me what the crop development on, maybe you're counting stalks. But you're not counting stalks in years. Certainly not counting all those years away. So there was again, the constant pressure of cost savings. So we have to convince everyone that it's a value. We have to compete in these reports against things which are flashy and shiny, which the cattle report is not. So think about this. I don't, but people send me all these press releases all day long from USDA. And I just can't imagine a press release that says, hey, I'm giving you the same cattle report I gave you last year. Aren't you excited about that? Right? Versus, hey, we supported this initiative and here's a bunch of money and we supported this initiative. That makes a press release. But we have to convince everyone, including folks up the chain and our producers who are thinking that there is value. Anything else?
Well, so to tag along with that, you said you hope to get a cattle report in January. Is that a serious comment?
I think that I will get my January report. I think I will get my January, I'm very confident I'll get my January report. Now, part of the reason you didn't get your July report is because Congress didn't pass a budget. That's part of the reason. Because the cattle report comes at the end of the year, so you're looking to find out where you will save your money, and that's just too easy hanging out. So I think I'll get my January. There shouldn't be any, there shouldn't be any issue with my January cattle. My July one, I don't know. But let me add on to that comment, which is, if you are a data person, what is the value of my July, what is the value of my January report if I don't have my July report? It's diminished. It really is diminished. What's the value of my next July report if I didn't have the prior July report? Now I don't have year over year changes. So it isn't just the disruption of missing one report. It is the one missing. I am almost assured I will get my January. I am less sure that I will get my July report. But I will do everything I can to make sure that I get my next report. And I think it's a good report. And they would like to do these things. They just got to find something at the end when a budget is passed later where they can save the money. And the cattle report is just too appealing sitting out there as the last expenditure.